Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder, a musket in your hand, and a wall of French bayonets marching straight at you. The ground shakes beneath their boots. Drums pound like thunder. Their columns stretch across the valley, a sea of blue coats moving as one. You can hear them shouting, chanting, their officers waving swords high as they urge the men forward. And you're part of a thin red line, barely 2 ranks deep, waiting on a ridge in the Portuguese sun. No cover, no retreat, just orders. Hold the line. Wait for the command. Every instinct screams to fire, to run, to do anything but stand still. Yet the British do not move. They watch the French climb closer, closer, until the enemy fills their sights. This moment, right here, is where 2 worlds of war collide. The French fight with passion and momentum. The British with discipline and deadly timing. One side believes courage will win the day. The other trusts in control. When the smoke clears, one of these great armies will be broken, not by numbers, but by nerve. To understand how it happened, we need to go back to the days leading up to Vimeiro. The year was 1808. Napoleon's empire stretched across Europe like a storm, from the fields of Germany to the heart of Spain. Wherever his armies marched, kings fell and flags changed. But in Portugal, a small British expedition had just landed, led by a young, sharp-eyed general named Arthur Wellesley. He wasn't a legend yet, not the Iron Duke, just a determined officer with a plan to stop the French tide. The French, under General Junot, had conquered Portugal with ease. To them, the British were an afterthought, a small force, far from home, clinging to the coast. But Wellesley knew something the French didn't. He understood his men. The redcoats trained to fire faster, steadier, deadlier than any army in Europe. And so, in the hills near a small village called Vimeiro, 2 very different armies prepared to fight. The French trusted in their columns, tight, fearless formations that relied on momentum and courage. The British trusted their lines, thin ranks of men who fought with precision and patience. 2 systems, 2 beliefs, 1 battlefield. And as the sun rose over the ridges of Vimeiro, both sides were about to find out whose way of war truly worked. The morning sun burned through the mist as the French army formed up in the valley below Vimeiro. Drums rolled like thunder over the hills, steady and relentless. Officers shouted orders, sabers flashing in the light. Thousands of men gathered into columns, tight, towering formations of blue and white, banners fluttering proudly above their heads. To the French, this was how war was meant to be fought. A wall of courage, a surge of muscle and will. They had crushed armies across Europe using this very method, storming forward in great waves that shattered anything in their path. Why should today be any different? From his position, General Junot believed the British line would crumble the same way others had. His columns began to move, the sound of boots pounding in perfect rhythm. The air filled with the metallic clink of bayonets, the rhythmic beat of drums, the breathless chant of soldiers urging each other on. But up on the ridge, Wellesley had already chosen his ground. His redcoats waited just behind the crest, hidden from view, muskets loaded and leveled. The British officers walked calmly behind the lines, reminding their men to hold fire. Not yet. Not until the whites of their enemies' eyes were visible. As the French columns began their climb, musket balls from British skirmishers started to hiss through the air, small cracks against the rising roar of thousands. Still the French pressed on, believing sheer momentum would carry them through. Closer and closer they came, the valley echoing with the rhythm of war. Smoke gathered, drums quickened. The ridge loomed ahead, silent, still, waiting. In just a few moments, courage and discipline would meet head-on, and only one would hold its ground. The sound hit first, a deep rolling thunder of feet pounding the earth. Thousands of French soldiers surged forward, the valley trembling beneath them. From the ridge, the redcoats could see the sunlight flashing on bayonets, hear the rhythm of drums echoing through the smoke. It was a sight meant to intimidate, to crush an enemy's spirit before the first shot was fired. The French columns advanced with all the confidence of an army that had conquered half of Europe. Their banners rippled proudly above their heads, blue coats glinting against the pale Portuguese hillsides. Officers at the front waved their swords and shouted, "En avant! Forward! their voices nearly lost beneath the roar of thousands. The British line, 2 men deep, stood waiting, motionless, silent. Behind the calm faces were pounding hearts and clenched jaws. The officers moved slowly down the ranks, checking bayonets, whispering reminders. "Steady, lads, steady!" They had been ordered not to fire until the French were close enough to see their faces. Every second dragged. The French drums grew louder. The air thickened with dust and heat. From a distance, the French advance looked unstoppable, like a tidal wave rolling toward a thin red string. But as they drew nearer, something began to change. The columns, packed shoulder to shoulder, began to lose shape as they climbed the ridge. The neat lines twisted over rocks and brush. The front ranks slowed. The rear pressed forward, bunching them even tighter. Officers yelled for order, waving their swords. But the sound of their voices was swallowed by the noise of their own men. And then, the first British volley. A single crash of sound split the air. The front ranks of the French column seemed to shudder. Men dropped. The wave faltered. Smoke billowed across the slope, turning sunlight into a red haze. The British had fired with perfect timing, a synchronized wall of flame and thunder. Before the smoke even cleared, came the second volley. And then a third. Each shot tore holes into the packed French ranks. Musket balls ripped through rows of men, and still, those behind pushed forward, trying to fill the gaps. Officers shouted and waved their swords, urging the survivors onward. They believed that once they reached the top, once they could bring their bayonets to bear, the redcoats would break as others had before. But the British line did not break. Wellesley's men fought like a machine. While the French fired wildly into the smoke, the redcoats reloaded with calm precision, powder, ball, ramrod, shoulder. Their training showed in every motion. They had done this hundreds of times before, on parade grounds and muddy fields alike. And now, that discipline was paying off. From the ridge, the fire rolled down the line like a living thing, volleys snapping in perfect rhythm, smoke pouring upward in waves. Each blast tore more gaps into the French column. The front ranks stumbled, fell, or turned aside, unable to advance through the storm. A few Frenchmen did reach the crest. They charged forward, bayonets lowered, faces blackened with powder and sweat. For a heartbeat, the fighting was close, brutal and fast. Muskets became clubs, bayonets clashed with bayonets. But even here the British held. Their line flexed but did not break. The French, crammed too tightly to swing or aim, could not use their numbers. Their courage had brought them to the top, but not through it. Down the slope, officers tried to rally the next wave. Drummers beat frantically. Flags waved. Shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" cut through the chaos. But now fear began to creep in. The once steady march dissolved into confusion. Men stumbled over the fallen, blinded by smoke, deafened by cannon fire from the British guns now joining the fight. A cannonball tore through the side of a column, sending bodies flying. The survivors froze for a split second, just long enough for another British volley to rip through them. At that moment, the illusion of French invincibility shattered. The columns began to waver. Some men turned back. Others hesitated, caught between pride and survival. Officers screamed for them to hold formation, but their words were drowned by the relentless crack of British muskets. And then, as suddenly as it began and the advance broke, the front ranks melted away, retreating in small, desperate groups. What had begun as an unstoppable wall of blue was now a scattered mass of exhausted, bleeding men running for the valley. The drummers were silent. The flags drooped. The noise faded into chaos. From the ridge, the redcoats reloaded, watching them fall back through the smoke. They didn't cheer. They didn't chase. Their officers simply gave the order to hold position. Calm, steady, as if it were just another drill. Down below, French officers tried to rally the survivors for another attack. Junot still believed his men could break the British if they regrouped, but every fresh column that advanced met the same fate. Each wave crashed against the ridge and broke apart under the fire of the British line. One after another, they fell. Courage meeting calculation, passion meeting precision. By midday, the battlefield was carpeted with smoke and silence. The French attacks had failed. The columns lay shattered in the valley, the ground littered with discarded muskets, drums and bodies. From his command post, Wellesley looked down and saw what his tactics had proven. Discipline and firepower had defeated the might of Napoleon's method. He didn't boast or celebrate. He simply prepared for the next move, knowing the French might try again. His officers, riding along the lines, nodded to their men. The redcoats had held firm. For the French soldiers retreating down the slopes, disbelief hung in the air heavier than smoke. They had marched into battle believing courage alone could win the day, that the sight of their columns would crush any enemy's will to stand. But on that ridge, they had met something stronger than fear. Calm, deadly control. And that's what made the British so dangerous. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. The French fought with fire, but that fire burned out against a wall of discipline. The British fought with ice, cold, measured, unflinching. As the afternoon sun dipped low, the battlefield of Vimeiro lay quiet except for the cries of the wounded and the distant rumble of retreating drums. The redcoats stood along the ridge, blackened with powder, faces expressionless, hands still gripping their muskets. They had done what few armies in Europe had managed. They had stopped the French advance head-on. This wasn't just a victory. It was a statement that the British way of war, built on steadiness and control, could stand against Napoleon's finest. From this ridge, a new kind of reputation began to grow, one that would follow Wellesley across Spain and into history. But for now, as the smoke drifted away and the sun set over the Portuguese hills, the question that had hung in the air all morning finally had its answer. When courage met discipline, when fury met control, when the French columns met the redcoat line, it wasn't the British who broke first, and when the guns finally fell silent, the hills of Vimeiro were veiled in smoke and sorrow. The valley below was strewn with blue, torn flags, shattered drums, and the still forms of men who had marched with unshakable faith. The French columns, once so proud and thunderous, were broken. Their courage hadn't failed, their method had. Up on the ridge, the redcoats stood in quiet rows, faces blackened with powder, eyes fixed on the horizon. They had fired until their muskets were too hot to hold, until the last echo rolled away into silence. Wellesley rode among them, nodding once. No triumph, no boast, just the calm of a man who knew he'd proven a point. The Battle of Vimeiro was more than a victory. It was a revelation. The age of the heroic charge was fading. The era of disciplined fire and precise tactics had begun. For Napoleon's armies, this was a warning that the British line, cool under fire, could not be swept aside by courage alone. And for Wellesley, it was the first step toward destiny, the making of the man who would one day stand against the emperor himself. But what did it all mean? Let's talk about it. The Battle of Vimeiro may have faded into the dusty corners of history, but its lesson still echoes across time. Because what happened on that Portuguese ridge wasn't just about muskets and uniforms, it was about mindset. About how people face chaos, fear, and pressure when everything is on the line. The French fought with passion, fearless, loud, driven by belief in their cause and their emperor. They trusted that courage would carry them through, that momentum could overcome discipline. It's the same instinct that pushes people, even today, to charge into challenges with nothing but raw willpower. But the British showed something different, the power of control under fire. They stood firm when instinct said run, waited when every heartbeat screamed to act. Their victory wasn't born of emotion, but of patience, preparation, and trust in the plan. That's what wins more often than not, in battle, business, or life. Every generation faces its own version of that ridge, moments when courage collides with discipline. And Vimeiro reminds us that real strength isn't always loud or fast. Sometimes it's the calm hand that holds steady while the world shakes. Because when the smoke clears, in war, in work, in life, it's not always the one who charges hardest who wins. It's the one who keeps their line. And that's the legacy of Vimeiro, the day discipline stood its ground, and the world learned who truly breaks first. It wasn't the louder army that won. It wasn't the braver one. It was the steadier one, the one that kept its nerve when the world around it broke apart. Every musket fired, every command held, every heartbeat that refused to panic. That was where victory was forged. And so the Battle of Vimeiro became more than a footnote in history. It became proof that courage alone is not enough, that true strength is quiet, patient, and precise. When the smoke cleared on that ridge, the world saw a new kind of power, and it wore red. If you enjoyed walking the ridge of Vimeiro with us, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more untold battles and forgotten tactics that shaped military history. Every week we bring you stories where courage met discipline, and history decided who stood their ground. Stay tuned, soldier.